Okay, so we are now approaching the last panel of this one-day conference entitled The Agency of Design. Our first speaker is Mitchell Joachim. Mitchell is co-founder of Terraform One and associate professor at the NYU. He's also a TED Senior Fellow and is considered one of the most influential designers committed to design experimentation and innovation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitchell Joachim. You have a pointer here if you need it on the slides there.
Super. It's always super great to be here. I guess actually, maybe it's not always super great. There's a little bit of anxiety because whenever I walk in the door, I think that there's some studio project assignment or something that I'm supposed to hand in, I'm positive I graduated, but I get that feeling. So that doesn't really go away even after over 10 years. So anyway, I'm going to start with a little bit of a video. It's only a minute long, and then I'm going to kind of show just 3 projects. Actually, really only 1 project, but 2 that kind of warm up to it. What I think urban metabolism, or what metabolics in cities are about right now. So this is some fairly new work for the Venice Biennale. It's in the Rotterdam Biennale at the moment, but I think I'm really excited to share it with you guys and then get a chance to talk about it and get some good feedback. So maybe if we could show this video real quick and then get into some slides. Thanks.
In the next 100 years, we can expect human population to reach 11 billion people. Is this something that is sustainable? The largest amount of people on this planet Earth live inside this circle. We use the Buckminster-Fuller Dymaxion map to take a view of the world and look at the 25 densest cities on the planet Earth. Our biomap displays population density as a parametric graph on the front. The back zooms in on each of these cities designed and built and grown inside petri dishes. We chose colonies of E. coli as a method of analog computation. Population density was represented in 2 different forms of bioluminescent E. coli. Red represented future projections of population density, while green represented existing conditions you would find in cities. Biology is technology. We use the dilution method to show the range of densities of E. coli populations in each petri dish. Stencils derived from CAD files would shape the E. coli into specific geometries that would show or display the current conditions in cities. We wanted to move away from the current paradigm of studying population through computation. We wanted a different method to explore how humans might affect the Earth. Cartographers, urban planners, biologists, and architects, all working to think about a map of the near future of human population.
Okay, so that's a recent project, video, Splash, what have you. There's more extensive versions. I was really thinking about this research question of the Malthusian population growth that we are, in a sense, suffering from, or at least maybe the planet's metabolism is suffering from. The idea that we're, where's this slide thing? Is this it? Oh, yeah, okay. The idea that the Earth is really much about overdevelopment and the extension of all of its resources. I think Paul Gilding, a CEO of Greenpeace, said it best: the Earth is full. Every economy on the planet, I mean, pretty much every leader that we know, goes under this kind of the single overriding predicate that growth is the only kind of way to continue how we think about our civilization. That single word, growth. And if the Earth is full, where do we expect to continue to grow? So if we're going to double our world's economies, I don't know where those resources are necessarily going to come from. Even if we become more and more rapidly efficient, we're doing less bad, but not necessarily more good. So one of the kind of first projects I'm looking at is that question of economy and the issue of hyper wealth being a big influence on our global metabolic rate. And here we use informatics as a way to be a part of this polemic of the 1% versus everybody else. And we try and show, not necessarily elite architects and planners, what some of the issues are, because you guys know, many intelligent people, certainly in America know, we actually want to communicate to Homer Simpson. He's kind of our universal client. And if we can hammer home some big ideas to him about what's happening with wealth or the economy or with population growth or with ecology, then I think we've got our message. And we'd actually like to engage good old Homer. So he's always the kind of the quiet person in the room when all of us get together. Looking at the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was a big part of our generation. It's really a fantastic moment. We kind of sat up there and said, the whole system doesn't work. Now, I didn't feel like taking a kind of a sign and, I don't know what they were all doing over there, yelling at cops and yelling at stockbrokers all day long. That is super important. I absolutely don't think that kind of democratic engagement should go away, but we thought we could best help by diagramming a few of the problems. So here's looking at this spike of wealth across the entire geography of Manhattan, all of the population and what their income sources are based on where they work. And this is over a course of a year. And so what we've mapped is essentially you get most of the income, and this is a la Doho Su, who's a phenomenal artist. You get most of the income in this kind of central white phallus, where you get so all of Wall Street producing roughly $1.2 to $1.4 million on the average. So this is 8,500 white people representing 8.5 million New Yorkers. We glued them all together and produced this model so that one could see kind of on a visceral level where the wealth is going. And this is Central Park, and you can see the difference between East and West Side, and then down at the kind of the base of the phallus where some of the money's being made. So that's doesn't give you a giant clue where funds are coming from. I don't know what else will. It's also kind of interesting to point out that our new mayor-elect just got a new police chief, and he was saying he was going to stop crime and the highest concentration of crime in the city of New York. And all of us had all kinds of pictures of where that was. And he took out a map and he pointed to Wall Street. I don't want to say that Wall Street's actually, the key problem, but something about this, the manipulation of policy and the issue of lobby, which is probably beyond the realm of design, but that's okay. I always get those kinds of questions. But that is a crucial link from the science to the actual implementation. There's always these missing opportunities, and I don't know why that is. It seems to be that in general people are in tune with the idea of changing how our civilization functions, or at least our metabolic flow. And it seems that a lot of companies are willing to do it, but at the end of the day, there's this disconnect. And I don't know what that scapegoat is, but there's a hint that the 1% might be a part of it. And we haven't succeeded in changing it, so perhaps shifting that target. So here's another view, changing off the issue of economy. This is a view of the metabolic streams of waste as a resource in all of New York City. So we produce 38,000 tons of trash per day in New York. That doesn't mean we're slobs. I don't know what the ratio is in Boston, but that's what we produce. And how do you communicate to Homer what that is? Can you even picture that? So we started with this huge parabolic graph that represents all the waste, and we moved from cities of capitalist concerns or the topology of the skyscraper for major corporations into the beginning of mining our landfills around New York, especially Fresh Kills, as an act of retrofitting or resource existing architectures, public spaces, etc., and learn to get more advanced in upcycling our design systems so that waste absolutely in the future goes away. Gertrude Stein said it best, away has gone away. You can't just throw things away. It always ends up someplace. But the idea here for this city is that through creation and creation and creation, there will never be anything such as waste anymore as a principle. So this is trying to communicate this in the form of the Statue of Liberty. This is 1 hour tower, or essentially 1 hour's worth of that 38,000 tons of trash takes up, and this is compacted waste, the Statue of Liberty. Here is a skyscraper produced every single 24 hours in New York. We get a 53-story skyscraper, potentially produced out of compacted waste in the city of New York. And we looked at ways to make that. That waste would be both organic and inorganic matter, piled up and becoming essentially compressed elements for the facade. And trying to communicate that on a more visceral level by getting into different shows as for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Here we were showing a 30-second flash of this waste in just e-waste. So not all waste, but just the stuff that's produced from when you buy a new microwave or refrigerator or a pair of speakers. This is kind of what you get. And we did this again for the new museum, this festival for the city. And there's a little QR tag, and there's a sign, a placard letting New Yorkers know this is what we do when we throw out all our e-waste. When I want to find the actual styrofoam, I called up a number of places. We got a group called Home Depot America, which is the delivery system for all of those domestic products, essentially big e-waste products that are delivered in New York alone. And we said we wanted to have just a day's worth of your e-waste so we can put the funk in functionalism and make something really cool out of it and explain to people how much you produce. They said we had 8 18-wheelers worth of styrofoam for us. And they were driving it to the Navy Yard right now for free. And that was way too much material. We ended up making this kind of ice star project, which was a lot smaller. It's all we can handle. Rent in New York it's just too much. But that was open and there for the public to engage in questions. And it was certainly a fun day. It had to be interactive, so at the end the kids got the chance to recycle it. They're really violent 8-year-olds. And they did a good job. And doing the same project as a continuous theme, e-waste in the city of Darmstadt. It filled up a gymnasium twice the size of this room. We had over 40 students working on little Wall-E-like robots deployed throughout all the public spaces in the city, also with tags letting folks know where their e-waste is coming from and if they want to do something about it. Because they were German students, they made a 28-foot tall one out of styrofoam. Here it is in the kind of the center square. This picture is definitely not doctored. It may look like that, but the sanitation crew came almost immediately, and they started circling around the project, deciding whether it was art or trash or art or trash. And we when they were going to throw it away, we went and tried to explain to them about waste in cities, and they sort of already knew. Not there. And the final project is a long engagement of the many things that we do at Terraform One, which takes up a whole host and range of ideas. But this is our work with synthetic biology. When I was here at the GSD, this whole green movement was just becoming. I took Hashem's Green Modern class. It was certainly world changing, but it was no one was really exactly. Well, there were some things happening, but it didn't really explode like it's exploded now. And I'm super thankful for ecology to be a part of the kind of the base dialogue in design. But what happened to me lately is that one real aspect is this idea of this new nature, or this third nature, or the control of nature through synthetics, kind of unnatural nature. And this became really curious. It led to my roommate at Harvard was Dr. Oliver Medvedik. We built a lab together. It's called GenSpace, a fully working cellular biology lab. Scientists and designers work side by side. We make a lot of mistakes. We screw things up. It's definitely not all Candyland, but we do get to some good projects that are successful. This last one, this one is actually a mycelium-based system we did for the new museum. This is using waste from cellulose waste and growing it into basically the root base of a mushroom from reishi. This could replace styrofoam. For those of you who don't know, Ecovative is a company that's already producing this. It's really fantastic material. We've been doing it for 5 or 6 years now. This is kind of showing you how that mycelium propagates. Science is counting. I made a comment before about the research seemed to be design agnostic. That's okay. We definitely do a lot of counting to get some of these things working, testing different strains, so we get just the right system that'll work for this for the mycelium. We did these mycoform blocks, which is mushroom-based blocks. David Benjamin's group, The Living, just won the PS1 MoMA prize with this exact same concept. Those guys have been working with us. They're right next to us in the lab. They're super cool. It's something I guess we all believe in as a kind of movement. We had to redesign the Petri dish to get these things to work three-dimensionally. So we were growing systems synthetically and growing them in geometries, like puzzle-fitting bricks, etc. And then combining them, kind of like laminates, in this case with the Cetobacter. Cetobacter would add to this kind of this hydrophilic properties and keep the shearing forces or the shearing ability of the material stronger. And we decided what would be something that the everyday person could understand. when it comes to all of this kind of ideas of materials and making. Well, and something that would be productizable. So here is a chair that we had designed that's grown in 7 days. It's now in production with Ecovative. There's actually a Chase Lounge version of this same thing. It's my daughter on this chair, essentially made out of grown mushrooms. Unlike an IKEA chair, which after 5 years of use goes into a landfill, contributing to that 38,000 tons, this thing goes into your garden and is a positive contribution to the ecology. It actually feeds and composts and adds to life. It's part of that culture of abundance. We can talk about the form of that chair, but that's a whole story about Hox genetics, and we're not quite there yet. This led to the larger thought about synthetic biology as a continuous system or idea for how we think about the globe and cities together. So here's a map about that population growth that I showed before between developing world and the developed world, and you can see this unbelievable hockey stick-like shift. Some think it'll be 10 billion people within 100 years. Others say 11 billion people. I don't know what that means. I can't visualize that. That became part of our theses. What does that look like? What are the implications? We started mapping it, looking at cities themselves, and not just the population growth, but the density of population. So this is a map projected for the next 100 years of 11 billion people in cities. And we saw the idea is not to study just one city, because that's absurd, especially today. That's 1950s thinking, maybe. I don't know. Today, the models are big enough. The data is already available. Computers are more than capable to think of the Earth, or at least all the cities on the Earth, in one contiguous mapping system. Because they are. We already know it. It's one superorganism. So we thought this population of 11 billion in their cities would be something mappable. Here's a great little moment. Most of the growth we're going to find is in this area, Asia. Certainly India and China, we'll see most of the world's population expanding. We use Bucky because we love Bucky, but Bucky was a great way of thinking of this holistic super city of the Earth and all of the different intensities. And we started to map it and project it. Think about a two-faced model. One, a parametric form on the front that would show the different intensities and growth rates of all these world cities mapped together as one component, projected over the next 100 years. Here's a kind of showing the different tessellations and the grid points, and then different colors representing the change in intensity. There's also a lot of areas here. You can see India's very intense. There's a lot of areas that are also shrinking. I'll show that in a minute. After kind of getting all this data sets compiled, we built our own thermoformer, did our own modeling system, and started to produce hundreds and hundreds of these objects to fit together in this map that ultimately was 22 feet in size. So you can see it spans from here, the parametric system, so with a dowel and a vacuum form system. These billiard racks is a mechanism to hold them, also because it's cheap. We just make triangles for $20 a piece became absurd. You can buy them in China for $3. And then here we get to the cities themselves, focusing in on those specific areas that were grown in Petri dishes, mapped in E. coli. Here's a front view of that model. Here we are kind of assembling one side of the model that has two faces. That is my beautiful wife, more intelligent, more talented, just better than me all around, but she's very pregnant at the time with our second kid, so population was definitely on our minds when we were doing this graph. Here's the kind of the entire world as a city, changing in its intensity. There's different sections of different areas. Just so beautiful to see the kind of the extreme differences between areas that are shrinking or areas that are expanding or areas that are remaining flat. It was attached to a complex LED component so folks can tune in and find out what their city is doing exactly over time. That was mapped to a computer nearby. And on the other side, we needed UV radiation to show the genetically modified E. coli. So this is the back of the map. There's another view. Another view of the front. And this is where the back of the map shows the 25 world cities mapped in E. coli, showing their change in growth and the densities of colonies in each particular city. And we attach them to USB microscopes so that folks can get to see those cell colonies working and get to measure the different densities. This is showing an area of shrinkage. This is an area where we plug in one of those Petri dishes. And this is where the science and the design came together. In this case, Istanbul. We first genetically modified E. coli which essentially we embedded a gene from jellyfish. It only costs a few $100 to begin this procedure, but we gave it a novel signature, the characteristic between either red or green. So we essentially produced ink made out of the E. coli, and then found out a method of creating an archival base for it so that it could be on display for months, if not years. And red would represent, in this case, the expansion of something like Istanbul, and green was the existing density that you would find in Istanbul. Became crazy while we were producing this is how do you control the geometry of E. coli? How do you expect it to last that long? And how do you kind of control those densities? And what happens when you fuse the two densities together between existing conditions we find in cities today and then projected conditions in the next 100 years? So those fusing moments became really, really exciting between the two as the density using the dilution method was exchanged separately in different agar plates and then combined together to make the maps. This is showing that it is working under UV, about 350 microns of UV light. It does glow, which is cool. We had to figure out how to possibly draw or begin mapping with these things. So we used a point-based system, series of pin beds to do it at first, and then printers. Eventually, we settled with a computer-driven stencil mechanism, CAD stencil production, to control the geometries. Here are some of what the microscopes show. These have reflective plates behind them. We thought that as the viewer sees these Petri dishes, they're usually saying, so what? It's so small. Why'd you bother? Kind of thing. But when you see them up close and you see them changing, zooming in and out from 60 to 300 times magnitude, it becomes more fascinating. Here's the 25 densest cities on Earth projected for the next 100 years that we began mapping. Here they are, all kind of grown and shaped in Petri dishes with E. coli. They are living, and then we used actually a variation of Sobo glue to kind of keep them archived. So here's Istanbul. Here is the CAD stencil system. Here it is alive under UV radiation and embedded into the back of the maps. This is showing in one of our installations. We got suddenly a bunch of commissions for adding it, so we built 2 walls for double the price. Why not? One in Toronto and then one in Rotterdam, and then going to the Biennale. And that is a really quick review of just 1 or 2 projects of ours. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Mitchell. We continue with the second speaker of the last panel, Chris Reed. Chris Reed is, of course, is the founder and the founding principal of STOS, and currently an associate professor in practice of landscape architecture here at the DSD. His research interests include the impact of ecological sciences on design thinking and city-making strategies informed by landscape systems and dynamic. Please join me in welcoming Chris Reed.
Great, thanks, Nikos. Thanks to you and Danny and all the others for a pretty good day. I'm quite full already. This is a bit of a messy presentation. I'm kind of figuring it out on the fly here. In part, it's a talk about the Projective Ecologies project that I've been working on for a couple years, which looks at ecological thinking and design practices and the various interrelationships there. But in part, I'm going to talk about some of a few next speculative steps under the rubric of projective processes, where I've started to look at time-based speculative projective modeling and animation techniques. But in some ways, the talk is a beta version, really, of an emerging thought yet to be fully developed. So I'm happy to hear feedback. I will speak from the standpoint of ecology and design. The past few decades have witnessed a resurgence of interest in dynamic ecologies and landscape within contemporary design discourse. In part, this was fueled by ecologists' reconceptualization of the world, where the field really moved from classical determinism, you all know this, and a reductionist Newtonian concern with stability, certainty, and order, in favor of more contemporary understandings of dynamic systemic change and the related phenomena of adaptability, resilience, and flexibility. But it was also fueled by designers' ambitions to open up discrete disciplinary pursuits to a broader set of informants as a step toward projects which hybridize architectural, urbanistic, and landscape agendas. And we've seen a number of those already today. Ecology intrinsically entails a process of exchange through different cycles. That's not working. Is that working? Yeah, okay. Through different cycles, processes, and flows, these exchanges engender different forms and formats of interaction that can be expressed through linkages, connections, and relationships. Through a range of different inputs and outputs, these processes can take on physical and performative forms. These systems expend energies and produce wastes, weaving in and out of different material conditions and spatial configurations. But these exchanges are not only consumers, they're also sources and resources for new energies, new synergies. Through moisture regimes, degrees of fertility, light flows, and other metabolic services, these exchanges have outcomes, effects, and yields. And in this way, ecologies are productive and generative of new futures. And what's recently become a kind of classic representation of a kind of metabolic ecological system from H.T. Odum. And it's really the coordination and calibration of these exchanges where design now can become a great director or instigator of productive capacities. But in terms of the bigger project, ecology for us wasn't simply a project of the natural sciences. Felix Guattari, writing in The Three Ecologies, for instance, argues that ecology is as much bound up in issues of social and economic power, demographics, and political struggles and engagement as it is in operating in relationship to environmental forces. Rayner Banham outlined a combination of geography, climate, economics, demography, mechanics, and culture, made evident only via movement on the city's characteristic roads and freeways that constitute what he called four organizational ecologies for metropolitan Los Angeles. And Kazis Farnalis, building on that work, referred to the networked ecologies of LA as, quote, a series of codependent systems of environmental mitigation, land use organization, communication, and service delivery. And it's really these broader definitions of ecology which have become the basis for the Projective Ecologies project, which I've been working on with the ecologist and planner Nina Marie Lister. Projective Ecologies takes stock of the diversity of contemporary ecological research and theory, and it speculates on potential paths forward for design practices. Where are ecological thinking and theory now? What do current trajectories of research suggest for future practice? How can advances in ecological research and modeling, social theory, and digital visualization inform with greater rigor more robust design thinking and practices? Now here the modifier projective is both important and suggestive. With it, we recognize the constructed nature of ecologist models for the physical and dynamic aspects of the natural world. The ecologist Stuart Pickett, speaking here a couple years ago, commented that, in fact, all that ecologists have to work with are their conceptual models of ecosystems, as only rarely can they test ideas on and in the ecosystem itself. The term projective, therefore, embraces the creative and speculative ambitions of representation, the drawings and often heuristic models that scientists, designers, and others use to help demonstrate and explain ideas. In many cases, it's through this work of modeling, whether in writing or drawing, that ecological ideas have continued to emerge and are clarified. Now, as part of this work, both ecologists and designers have been productively obsessed with the ways in which these ideas of dynamism, adaptability, flexibility could be represented or projected. Ecosystems, landscapes, and even entire cities have been rendered as dynamic metabolic systems that put into play energy, matter, water, wildlife, people, vehicles, waste, and atmospheres, just for starters. These drawings have been instrumental in constructing dynamic new conceptualizations of the world. In all, then, Projective Ecologies is a recognition of a growing alignment between ideas about the various interrelationships between plants, animals, and the physical, biological, cultural, and experiential world in which we live, on the one hand, and the contemporary theories about the complex, unpredictable, and emergent nature of the world, a world increasingly recognized as a hybrid of culture and nature, where old dualisms are being supplanted by transdisciplinary thinking, uneasy synergies, complex networks, and surprising collaborations. Now, part of the focus of the book is really a collection, curated collection of drawings by ecologists and designers, and I want to show you just a few of those. First, by the ecologist Richard Foreman. Foreman's work, importantly, recognized the dynamic living nature of ecological systems, how the material of the physical world supports the movement and exchange of ecological matter, water, seeds, and wildlife. And it's important to point out that Foreman was working within a design context here at the GSD. And in fact, Stan Allen's explicit reference to Foreman's work, marrying the operative and performative aspects of dynamic ecologies with emerging design theory, moved the discussion of complex adaptive systems out of the domain of environmentalism and ecology and landscape alone and into the center of design discourse and theory. This happened late 80s, early 90s. And in some ways, that transition is manifest in work for the Downsview Park competition, first by the firm Field Operations, working directly with Stan Allen and Nina Marie Lister, but also in the work of some of the other entries, including Bernard Schumy's team with Derek Revington, which started to visualize these ideas of succession, ecological succession, and the long term. These are choreographies now of autonomous environmental processes that at that point really became part of the design playbook. Others have taken this on, done some really wonderful work. Here, the landscape architect Gross Max, working with the artist Mark Dion on a landscape art installation they called Delirious Pyreneesian Bloom, which is depicted really as a metabolic urban ecology, an orgiastic dance of seeds and pollen and wildlife and water and gases, all kind of growing on a fire escape at the back of an urban townhouse. Now, this kind of thinking, this kind of representation, of course, isn't particular to landscape, but has been brought into the realm of the city as well. We've seen examples today. Lou Kahn, pictured here, looked at the city in motion. Philadelphia, now characterized by its flows and movement exchanges rather than defined by its physical infrastructure. Of course, the work of Pierre Belanger, looking at the aggregated landscape of waste cycling, material movements, and resource exchanges developed during the past 5 centuries of growth throughout the port of Rotterdam. Others like Andrea Hansen looking at Tokyo Bay and the interactions of water and wind and pollutants and urbanization, now thought of and depicted really as a complex hybrid ecosystem. Some of these interests in choreographies of metabolic or at least hydrologic processes, very evident in our own work at STOS as well, in which we look at manipulating and coordinating hydrologic systems as ecological, social, and urbanistic catalysts in any number of projects. And in looking really at the processes of retooling and remaking the city of Detroit, putting into play issues of industrial contamination and remediation, new and alternate economies, material deconstruction, landscape, energy, and public services. It's also made its way into the work that I've been doing recently here at the GSD, the scripting of productive ecologies, spatial and temporal scenarios, in this case of aquaculture, and adaptive waste processing landscapes that become simultaneously farms and filters as a basis for a new productive form of urbanism. But I guess just as the book's about to be published, I've also realized that we've exhausted the possibility of these 2- and 3-dimensional drawing techniques that we've been using for so long. I'm done with drawing arrows. Now, I'm becoming more interested in a number of time-based projective modeling and scripting techniques which move beyond simulation and open up new territories, I think, for design investigation and discourse. Now, I'm not the first. Brad Cantrell's been working down at LSU, looking at temporal diagrams through particle simulation, here depicting depositional patterns within the cross-section of a riverbank. Bobby Petrusco, here at the GSD, looking at agent-based simulations of hydrologic flows across existing terrains. A couple years ago, I was working with some students using Aquaveo, which is a platform utilized by hydrologic engineers, in order to explore the agency of water flow relative to an underwater garden of oysters and seaweed in a search really for setting up a set of constructive feedback loops. Sorry for the jumpiness of this video. It smooths out as it goes along. More recently, with a few students, I think, who are in this room, we've been looking at water flows and people flows as a model and a metaphor for new adaptive urbanism on the shores of Jamaica Bay in New York City. This, in many ways, is a project about the city that's tied directly to dynamic environments. And while some of the flow modeling techniques were really just used as a stepping off point, I think they very productively informed a new idea about a project that could constantly adapt itself to changing conditions. And finally, work that I did just last semester with Danny Ibanez teaching with me, studio called Projective Processes, where the intent was really to explore the projective potentials of these four-dimensional modeling techniques, techniques that emphasize flow and process, time and change. We used a number of different platforms. You see processing here as a start. But the studio was speculative in many ways. It was a series of experiments in the agency of time and process and of atmospheres in the imagination. The trope for the studio is what we call the liminalarium, a place associated with the study, presentation, and experience of inland water ecosystems, rivers and lakes, water in its many states and manifestations and absences. The liminalarium was a fictional place, a place for the imaginative and the sensorial, one full of changing atmospheres and ripe for speculation. This is the beginning of a series of studies that really looked at the micro processes of water, but generally we were interested in questions of how we work, how we think, how we speculate, and what are the potential vehicles for design. This project by Taeyang Park and Haimin Choi really looks at different processes, different microprocesses associated with water under the rubric of turbularia, a place for the study of turbulation, really. Turbulation for them meaning the enforced movement of a photographic bath to overcome stagnation at the surface of film or paper during process. That's the dictionary definition. For them, the idea was to create an instigatory experimental vehicle that was very much equally about process and equally about image making or the sensorial. This was not a romantic and restorative approach to, in this case, the LA River, but one more fine-tuned to the metabolics of effluent runoff and the guiding transportation networks, concrete channels, and soft bottoms that really define the LA River basin. In many ways, it's a nimble strategy for a series of dynamic hydrologic gardens that serve no direct function other than the playing out and experience of water processes and phenomena. I think it's clear from those experiments that they're as interested in the physical form, the scaffold, as they are in the processes and phenomena that would be produced. Other projects were really quite diverse, looking at combination of bacteria, water, wind, and topography in the denuded lake basin of Owens Lake. This is a project really about time and mineralogy in Owens Valley, where the students' interest here was in salt accumulation, bacterial growth, and the seeming absence but clear influence of humans over time, all as characters of the stories that unfolded here in a time frame of decades, centuries, and millennia. Their project anticipated new stories, new experiences, both sensorial and some that were sensual, of the sheer materiality and deep temporality of this abandoned site. And a whole lot of flowy pink things. Others looked at seeding strategies that could capitalize on the various forms of current and projected human occupation, strategies that would reinscribe the lake bed with new hybrid ecologies using visitors, environmental phenomena like wind, and infrastructure as instigators. And finally, a project that looked at wind and dust-based touristic agendas. That was the one video we're having trouble with. And it's working. Yeah? Yeah, it's moving. Cool. A project that really rescripts the ecological and voyeuristic aspects of this denuded lake basin. In many ways, this project presents the ecology of the dust storm as a new consumable spectacle. Can you see that? Here, Alice proposed a series of moving creatures and interactive fields that could continually recalibrate the ecological and experiential futures of this place. The proposed interventions here transform the dust storm into a performative and consumable event and activate Owens Lake into a kinetic and responsive field of dust control measures that respond to different user groups, seasonal changes, and wind patterns. All of these projects, I think, move beyond an apologetic, restorative approach to what we've been calling today, I think, old nature, and recognize and adapt the adapted, conflicted nature of the various ecologies actually in play in sites like this. The bigger project, of course, is to speculate on new opportunities for design, to present new frameworks for thinking, new synergies and cross-fertilizations among disciplines, new ways of designing within a dynamic, metabolic, living, and throbbing world. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Our last speaker on the third panel is Ayla Berman. Ayla is the new O'Donovan Director of the University of Waterloo School of Architecture and Principal of Scale Shift Design. Ayla, coincidentally also for this event, is a Doctor of Design graduate from the GSD, and her research investigates the relationship between culture and the evolution of contemporary material and spatial practices. Please join me in welcoming Ayla Berman.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Donnie, Nikos, and Pablo, it's great to be here, great to be back. I also, like Mitchell, I always, I come back here and I sort of resurrect past histories that I haven't thought about in a long time. Today, as an overview of the proliferating trajectories of contemporary design, and as a follow-up to a conference that I co-chaired last year with Ed Mitchell called New Constellations, New Ecologies, this presentation will situate the concept of urban metabolism in relation to 4 of the 6 themes that were previously defined in the conference as new constellations of architectural practice that have emerged as byproducts of or as responses to the radical impacts of environmental, technological, and demographic transformation. Within the context of rapidly expanding global socio-technological networks on the one hand, and we could say the inadvertent effects that such forms of anthropogenic territorial colonization have had at the planetary scale on the other, design in some ways has never been more pervasive and powerful, and yet at the same time so vulnerable to the forces that are influencing its potential and capacity. From the creative recycling of urban wastelands and the recircuiting of energy-producing infrastructure to responsive architectures and synthetic ecological systems that purport to both shape and dynamically adapt to the populations they support, the reconceptualizations of design in accordance with a technobiotic paradigm, and we've seen many examples of this, and the new trajectories it has spawned are perhaps the unintentional consequences of course, thinking the city as a living system of material flows rather than a static collection of discrete artifacts. This idea of the city has enabled the evolution of new types of projects and fields of operation that are extending the traditional domains of architectural and urban agency within the realms of matter, energy, ecology, form, space, and technology. And these might be thought as new constellations of architectural and urban practice that are productively recircuiting existing strategies and contributing to the ways in which urban metabolism is being reconceived in relation to design. Just as steel, concrete, and glass were the new homogeneous materials to represent the industrialization of the 20th century, of modernity, and plastic signified the utopian trajectory of the 60s, for our post-millennial future, perhaps one of the most important raw materials for us will be trash. Currently, as our largest renewable resource, waste has become our new post-industrial nature and our future raw matter, a driver for new material economies and a critical matrix for future design endeavors. Waste management and ecological issues have been absorbed into recent architectural pedagogy, but are only recently being interrogated for the conceptual demand that they might be placing on the discipline. As Alan Berger had attested, drawscape follows the laws of the natural world, most notably the second law of thermodynamics, which works under the rubric that there is no growth without waste. If waste was once considered to be the excess of a system or matter out of place, we now understand it as an integral part of physical growth and urban life. Failed architectural ideas and built forms of previous economic eras, previous design trends, and previous political regimes, such as things like the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, initially designed by Albert Speer, or a Downsview Park in Toronto, the shrinking cities of all the post-industrial towns in the industrial Rust Belt territories of northeastern United States, the contaminated and derelict decommissioned military bases along the coast of California. These are all part of cyclical processes, making them new sites and sources of life forms and potential interventions. We now recognize waste as a byproduct of both progress and design, as a biological and cultural imperative, a reality that asks us to reinvent contemporary design paradigms to somehow more readily address these issues. If the material economies of wastelands are often invisible to us, it's because of their scale of operation, the illegibility of their forms, the hidden structure that defines their legality, their ownership, or the distance and complexity of their situations. It's also because their designation as waste renders them external to existing structures of signification, especially perhaps in relation to design. An initial response is therefore to render these sites and processes visible, This is McLean Cutter's rail banking project that maps unused railways and easements in Detroit so that these might start to become developed as public space, or Nicholas de Monchot's project Local Code that uses geospatial analysis to identify thousands of publicly owned abandoned sites in major US cities, such that the geographies and economies of waste are re-engaged as integral to the methodological procedures and production of architectural practice. Despite the obvious fact that our current deleterious environmental impacts would be substantially reduced if we simply manufactured, built, used, and disposed of less, a concept that somehow undermines the impulse towards excessive production that drives global capitalism, the true inversion of our modern obsession with production and consumption is not only to be found in their absence for those who yearn toward a pre-industrial future, but also perhaps in their much-needed reversal by amplifying processes and designs such as Lifescape by Field Operations or the High Line in New York that through the recycling of urban territories and infrastructures contribute to cultural digestion and regeneration. The reconception of Mises' dictum, less is more, as a call for creativity within the context of scarcity on the one hand and the imperative for zero waste on the other, we could see as a double-sided response to both the threat of diminishing resources and the exponential increase of industrial pollution. This might inspire us to design for disassembly and regeneration, creatively recycle our urban detritus, and optimize our approach to the economies of matter, energy, and space as much as we laud the creative generation of form. Projects like Growing Water in Chicago by Urban Lab, which attempts to recapture a percentage of the 1 billion gallons of water a day that are drained from the Great Lakes, operates by productively recircuiting the city, recycling wastewater through an urban matrix of eco-boulevards integrated into the city fabric. That use natural organisms as living machines to contribute to cultural digestion and regeneration. At the micro scale, as part of the Pavement to Parks initiative, 10 Mile Garden by Scaleshift and Extopia recycled portions of the public right-of-way, which was equivalent to 25% of city land, by transforming unused paved area in front of 9,000 fire hydrants in the city of San Francisco into a field of bioswales and community green space. And within the context of architecture, Big's waste-to-energy plant sited in the center of Copenhagen not only completes the waste-to-energy generation cycle, while also situating waste treatment now at the center rather than at the periphery of civic concerns, but also conjoins this with public recreational programming so that the building doubles as an artificial topography and civic ski slope for the terrain-craving urban dwellers living in the flat Danish landscape, which I thought was an interesting reinstantiation of MVRDV's earlier provocation in Metacity Datatown that reprogrammed urban trash as a new recreational material substrate. Energy circuits and artificial ecologies as dominant themes within the realm of urban metabolism ask us to imagine architecture and urbanism as dynamic integrated systems, that our buildings and cities be assessed not only in terms of their physical objecthood, but also in relation to their material processes and the multiple valences of their performance. As green landscapes are routinely called upon to cloak the surfaces of the future urban agropolis, from the active generation of energy-producing artificial terrain and new forms of urban agriculture, to an abundance of vegetal cladding systems intended to mitigate or recycle environmental pollutants that range from, on the upper left, the modernist architectonics of the very thin green line to the wild jungle-like camouflage of the truly anti-architectural. This is like the map between what is architecture and not architecture in the realm of green skin. We have to interrogate maybe the many assumptions that are governing our understanding to the environmental issue and our approach to energy and ecology within contemporary practice, and the ways in which these are unfolding through reprogramming and the invention of new architectural, infrastructural, and urban typologies. The conjoining of life-sustaining ecologies with material models of continuous energy conversion in relation to urban density is exemplified in Iwamoto Scott's HydroNet proposal for San Francisco 100 years into the future. HydroNet was imagined as a visionary infrastructural rhizome that attempted to connect the collection, storage, and distribution of water, power, goods, and people with a multimodal alternative energy production system drawn from local sources of water, fog, wind, and hydrogen. Along with capitalizing on the region's geothermal energy potential and creating coastal algae ponds for the production of hydrogen fuel, the project employs fog catchers to exploit untapped renewable water resources and maximizes the use of aquifers below the city for fresh water reserves, while also redirecting currently unabsorbed urban rain runoff to ensure their replenishment. HydroNet was conceived as a massive supplementary artificial urban ecosystem that is driven by recycled alternative resources and newly acculturated natural forces, drawing their codes as well as its spatial and material inspiration from biotic and environmental paradigms. In projects such as Beta Bridge, the recycling of urban infrastructure, in this case, the reuse of the soon-to-be-demolished eastern span of the existing Bay Bridge connecting Oakland to San Francisco, is combined with strategic devices to not only capture water from fog and rain, but also recircuit energy from sun, wind, and the housing of data farms serving the Bay and local tech industries in order to try to generate $1.6 billion annually to supplement the rebuilding of California's infrastructure. The multivalence of these projects displaces the modern concept of monofunctional infrastructure, and akin to cross-species interdependencies found within the natural world, redefines programmatic adjacencies in relation to the linking of metabolic inputs and outputs within their architectonic systems. The redefinition, in many ways, of site, infrastructure, building, and program through the concept of metabolism enables the production of complex matter and energy-exchanging synthetic ecologies that attempt to resurrect terminal systems by hybridizing and recircuiting their flows through reconceptualized orgware structures, policies, legal instruments, and programming strategies as much as design. This is also evident in what Lola presented this morning, the Renewing the Salton Sea project by Lateral Office, an innovative remix of ecology, industry, and leisure to displace what has become a hydrological cesspool for adjacent agricultural runoff and mitigate water pollution in an arid landscape where water scarcity is a life-threatening reality. Our new understanding of architecture as infrastructures to recircuit matter and energy has also shifted our focus not only toward designing instruments that facilitate its measurable exchanges, but also toward amplifying their gradient flows, atmospheric effects, and the sensory experiences of the microenvironments that we create, now being reconsidered as primary material constituents along with stone, concrete, steel, and glass of buildings and cities. We're asked by Sean Lally, for example, of Weathers, to envision architecture not only as an acculturated physical extension of the geological crust of the Earth's surface, but also as the bottom layer of an ocean of air, and invest the same degree of design intelligence and invention into the organization of its thermodynamic, acoustic, and electromagnetic milieus. Sorry, air is a little harder to see, obviously. Or to focus design, in this case, on the interaction of microclimate gradations. This is Philippe Rahm's Phase Shift Gateway Park in Taichung, a true landscape-scaled Deleuzian body without organs that's based on the local intermixing and artificial production of heat, humidity, and pollution as occupiable environments. As a third constellation, genetic systems and multi-agent networks, digital technologies and new parametric practices that are emulating living models, genetic coding, and dynamic evolutionary processes that function at multiple scales are radically changing the way in which we integrate material information into the design process. The potential impact of these processes and the design of multi-agent systems on metabolic thinking is in their capacity to be performative, to shape spatial practices by embedding interactive parameters that are continuously in flux into the design of the system, such that the changing inputs are responded to through the formal and spatial outputs generated. In the initial design investigations early on of MVRDV, for example, the progeny of datascapes representing quantifiable interacting socioeconomic, environmental, and programmatic pressures that would influence a particular territory are bred with diverse morphological typologies to expose the shaping effects of changing parameters on the system. Multi-agent networks are intelligent, decentralized systems composed of relatively discrete elements, each of which operates as an independent actor within a larger dynamic collective. These systems are notable for their ability to generate complex global behavior that emerges through the interaction of a simple set of local rules. Initially evolving from computer simulations of swarming, schooling, and flocking activities, multi-agent networks have been used to model a wide range of phenomena, including the behavioral life of ecosystems, the diffusion of global innovation in economics, the spread of disease and epidemiology, the mapping and anticipation of traffic patterns, and the simulation of self-organizing systems and evolutionary and ecological dynamics. Given their dependence on open-ended algorithmic procedures that define relationships between individual elements rather than prescribing a larger set of formal types, the application of such networks to architecture has produced a wide range of practices, many of which can be seen to fall into three broader categories, which we can think of as multi-agent matters, urbanisms, and interactive systems. The artificially entangled life forms I've heard about by Francois Roche, for example, we can think of as an example of the first type. It's constituted by self-organizing elements whose local parameters determine behaviors that basically simulate generative patterns of form growth and development, such that the architecture created, which is similar in ways to a termite mound, is a residual material trace of the morphogenetic evolution of the system over time. This project's fantastical and habitable landscape, which purports to be an endlessly adaptable communal living environment, is a growing swarm of matter that registers the local negotiations of its citizenry through its own responsive protocols that transcode human desires, spatial requirements, and external contextual information into adjustable material behaviors. Akin to coral growth deposition, the project also integrates the constructive methods of its fluid architecture into the very processes of its emergence. It's fabricated by a machine called VIAB, which is a biomechanical, architecturally scaled 3D printer that's meant to literally secrete the structure's contour-crafted enclosure in response to variable conditions of occupancy, load, and use. The second type of multi-agent system refers to a form of generative urbanism focused on the collective emergence and behaviors of discrete populations, infrastructures, building clusters, and territorial elements, whose origination and interaction are determined by algorithms applied to programmatic directives and parametrically calibrated environmental influences. And these can instigate, obviously, a range of potential settlement scenarios and adaptive urban topographies, or as in projects like edible infrastructures, locally adjusted metabolic structures, and food distribution networks for the productive city. In adaptive urban fabric designed for Mumbai, generative systems were applied to structural planning variables such as connectivity and modes of territorial occupation, as these were influenced by a range of environmental and economic factors. These influences, which include things like the level of noise pollution, access to water and greenery, topography, buildable density, and land value, are established as parameters that are then weighted relative to location and attributed numerical values. The superimposition of these different layers of influence and their values are then spatialized across the territory. as a type of gradient field to which optimized systems of distribution, such as, in this case, the branching network establishing infrastructural connectivity or the cellular allocation of building plots are then adapted. And as these parameters and gradient fields change, so do the spatial morphologies of the architectural envelopes they essentially influence. Now, the difference between these first two types is relative and, of course, is dependent on the scale of operation of the system, the degree of discretization or continuity of its components, and the way in which temporality gets defined within the system. In the first case, for example, time is registered in the procedural traces of the final architectural artifact, which, despite how perceptually animate it might appear, is, of course, no longer fluid, mobile, or adaptive, just as the growth of natural objects retain the traces of material events within their very formation. In the second case, the trajectory of time is retained within the potential multitude of projective scenarios that it might produce, just as a game's virtual envelope refers to the plurality of all possible plays and aggregated outcomes determined by the rules of interaction and the constraints of the system, as a way of testing hypotheses in relation to complex interacting elements and forces. Now, we might imagine that such forms of swarm intelligence are, of course, or that reflect these local interactions and negotiations and feedback loops of diverse populations are already in operation in the everyday metropolis and responsible for its metabolism and continuously emerging form. What perhaps distinguishes contemporary computational models from these, however, is the embedding of design intelligence and intentionality into the system through algorithmic protocols where multiple individuated agents representing different variables or urban particles in the system are encoded with desires or behavioral imperatives that define their ability to self-organize into the inhabitable clusters and infrastructural networks of urbanity. Despite the scale and ambition of these systems, their true complexity and relevance in relation to the multi-level dynamics of the urban environment and its metabolism is still ultimately dependent on the selection, number, and definition of variables represented by the agents within the system, the part-to-whole relations or nested hierarchies that are intrinsic to urban morphologies and populations, and that elaborate the concept of agency within the system, the quantity and complexity of spatial, demographic, programmatic, and environmental inputs, and the forces that the system is able to absorb and respond to, the way in which these internal and external stimuli are coded, and the programmed rules that govern local behaviors in the network and that are ultimately responsible for the production of its architecture and urban morphology. And finally, the last type of interactive multi-agent system that I'm going to refer to today, which might be understood as an extension of the nervous system influencing the city's metabolic structure, is one that's programmed to operate continuously in real time, and that also endows surfaces, structures, and spaces with a form of embedded intelligence that render them responsive to perpetually changing inputs. The amplification and pervasiveness of information technologies within our contemporary culture has led to a new interactive paradigm that's both theoretical and physical within architectural practice. On the one hand, we could say that smart materials and the microscale of miniaturized technologies, coupled with our extended computational capacity, have enabled us to program matter, to render it intelligent through interactive embedded technologies that have expanded the performative capacity of designed objects, such as micro wind turbines that are integrated into buildings and infrastructure, passive solar collectors embedded in clothing that double as portable lighting, or things like smart e-bikes that recircuit cycling and braking energy as electric power while mapping pollution levels, traffic congestion, and road conditions in real time. On the other hand, the idea that buildings and infrastructure would operate as programmable exchange terminals within a larger and more complex urban network that are further embedded with microtechnologies operated by the populations that use them is symptomatic of our reconceptualization of the city according to a cybernetic paradigm. As this augmented understanding of program incorporates and adapts the feedback of its users, environments, or other living systems through things like smart technologies or envirosensitive sensor networks. Architectures start to become interactive while also emulating the dynamic properties of the context in which they're embedded. The Living Light Pavilion, for example, which is simultaneously networked to the city's environmental monitors and its users, tracks, maps, and communicates urban air quality in the 27 regions of Seoul, Korea. Responsive systems are used to express the changing choreography of inhabitation, respond to the shifting needs and behaviors of occupants, or react to changing environmental conditions through a gradient infrastructural field that organizes the variable spectra of potential responses and is in continual communication with a larger network. The technological interface between digital information and the scale of operation of the city in real time is intensifying, creating new paradigms for the smart city that mix web-based social networks with digital footprints and urban informatics, invisible forms of civic monitoring, tracking, and engagement. These engender live feed and crowdsourcing databases and infrastructural networks and intelligent systems that support everything from traffic, parking and energy optimization, crime and disaster prevention, accessible public services for healthcare, education, and tourism, to street maintenance and waste tracking and management. As we imagine a future network sensing and actuated city, we are projected into a McLuhan-esque environment of billions upon billions of addressable sub-objects where emerging technologies have and will continue to transform not only our organizational systems, our research methods, and our social structures, and therefore our own human agency, but also the sentience of our bodies through the amplified capacity that allows us to now digitize and network urban processes. Just as mass customization allows us to democratize rather than standardize design, Carlo Ratti postulated that interactive systems replace the generic user with one whose activities or transient preferences become hyper-individualized, not only within space, but also, of course, within time. But collectively, however, these preferences, just like crowdsourced data, engender new mobilized democracies and discursive and communal networks and new constituencies and forms of agency that transform our relationship to each other and also to space. Environmental and social volatility, the migrations of populations, infrastructural demands, and shifting economies operating at the regional and global megascale are accelerating the rate at which cities are transforming and evolving in response to pressures and opportunities that extend beyond the boundaries of the traditional city and seemingly also outside the agency of architects. These and other factors are rendering in many ways obsolete traditional planning techniques and the typical role of the architect, while also demanding new forms of agency and intervention, new methods of urban decoding, and the invention of a new toolbox of spatial concepts and design strategies with which to reimagine, redefine, and recircuit the 21st century city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ayla. I think this extensive overview of projects is a great way to shift to the final concluding discussion on actually what is the agency of the designers in relation to urban metabolism. So I would like to ask our speakers to join Hashim Sarkis on stage. Hashim is, of course, a professor here at the Graduate School of Design. He's the Aga Khan Professor of Landscape Architecture and Urbanism, and also director of the Aga Khan program and the New Geographies Lab.
Good afternoon. Is this working? Yeah.
Practice what we preach.
Yeah. It's very good to have you both back and to see you again, Chris. It's. I will speak from my point of view. Seeing people, classmates, old students come back is great. After, not only do they bring back amazing accomplishments, but it also has a troubling effect on us, because I feel like I've been here forever. If you feel certain problems with coming back, I also feel like I've been on eternal detention somehow. I'm still here. Thank you, gentlemen, and the team also for organizing this amazing event. And I'm very sorry I missed the panel before because I had to teach. But I do bring with me certain observations based on what I saw, which is fantastic, but also on certain reference to historical examples in relation to metabolism. And one of the main promises of the metabolist movement or movements, whenever they appear historically, when confronting architecture, is that they challenge the simplistic readings that architects have had up to the moment the metabolists come in confronting the relationship with the environment. And usually this confrontation is presented as a confrontation between metabolist challenges and settled organicist understanding of how architecture relates to the environment in general. At times of crisis and at times of trying to recalibrate the scale of its operations, architecture tends to lean on an organicist reading of how it could behave vis-a-vis its setting. And by that I mean that there's a certain underlying understanding that it's a gestalt-bounded organism that we operate in, that if we are able to think about it as a series of systems that produce patterns that we can plug into, then there is a certain belief, a faith, that we can make a difference. And this organicism has come historically with a lot of references to a kind of anthropological understanding and anthropomorphic understanding of both the setting and architecture, to a deep faith in patterns, and I refer to the timeless way of building reading of patterns by Alexander, that if we only understand them, they are there forever and we can plug into them and we can make a change. But also to two things that some of you referred to today. One has to do with the idea that we need to make visible, and coming back to the problem of the Gestalt, and to probably an allegorized understanding of the relationship between the here and the there. That if I'm operating here, I understand through certain allegories, telling stories about patterns and all, that I am affecting the there. That story is enough for us to make a difference. And I refer to these confrontations historically, starting with people like Frank Lloyd Wright and Goff, to Alexander, to many contemporaries that shall remain nameless. If I can describe it differently, if in the face of crisis, and we're always talking about crisis whenever metabolism appears or organicism appears, organicism confronts somehow the world with a safety blanket. Metabolism tends to go all out and blanket the world with a kind of fire of change that is not afraid. I feel that one of the great things about the presentations that we heard today is that they do not fall in the traps of organicism, but to the contrary, they actually very deliberately question some of its premises. We are not talking about bodies, but we're talking about genetics. We are not talking about geometries, but we're talking about algorithms. We are trying to see the world without mediations of certain systems, inspired anthropomorphically. We are talking about grafts. We are talking about abrupt changes and cataclysm. And we are also talking about the possibility of action without relying on certain preconceived models. And yet, I'm looking at the work in its best form, and it's actually quite inspiring at all levels, and wondering whether it is possible for us as designers to engage at all in all of this without being simplistic, without being allegorical, without being literal, and without relying on a conception of faith. In other words, is it possible for us at all to operate in this scientific epistemology of ecology, of economy, of politics, political sciences, and produce alternatives from within those systems that we describe. I would like to suggest that perhaps this organicism is not a trap, but a given for us, that we cannot operate outside it, and that perhaps we have to accept that the visuality and the physicality of architecture are important for us to perform and to act on changing systems in unchanging ways. I would like to suggest that perhaps we are not capable of operating within the scientific epistemologies that you're trying to embrace fully, but that we might be able to borrow from that and make visible some aspects of it, which all of you alluded to. I also would like to suggest that perhaps we are running too fast towards the scientific epistemologies and abandoning what I would consider as an alternative being the aesthetic epistemologies. And more importantly, abandoning the anachronistic, illusional aspects of architecture, which have been some of its more effective ways of effecting change. I ask these questions because I, on the one hand, completely endorse the engagement of the larger scale issues that you think architecture is condemned to engage, and it is. But at the same time, I am worried that by abandoning the aesthetic, we are abandoning the possibility of action altogether.
Does this come out? All right, I'll leave it in. You can hear me. I'm not sure what the if there was a question, even though there was a lot of propositions. I just wanted to say I think it's absolutely critical that we don't give up our commitment to the aesthetic, the visual, the things that we are trained to do, let's say as architects, and I'm using the term broadly. But I think at the same time, if I take the analogy of the metabolic, which I was applying to many different kinds of systems, and if we apply it to the way in which we are thinking about the operational world of the architect, it might mean that we have to start thinking about that as a kind of larger extended network that isn't bound as a territory with its own boundaries, but that has to make these kinds of links in order to enable flows across a system so that we ourselves don't become terminal, suffocate and die by cutting off our own life forces in some way. And it's not about abandoning the architectural, because I think that's a mistake. You know, I think that we have incredible specializations that are often that we're often talking to each other about, but afraid to actually support in relation to a larger territory. And that's why I think the linking up, the kinds of collaborations, I mean, Mitchell, I'm sort of fascinated with the collaborations that you're doing every day, because I think it's not about us becoming the biologist, but it's about us talking to the biologist, or talking to the engineer, or talking to the one who's constructing a legal policy. That we have to be able to link up those kinds of expertise in order to facilitate the flows. And maybe as another piece of this, and in a way this goes back to a question at the end of the last panel about, you know, the kind of territory for architecture. And right now, on the one hand, we keep enlarging the territory, but it's really the notion of a kind of network that has become almost the image, right? It's all about the network, and the network is infinitely extended. And every time we want to define something, it's the great moment of cultural colonization, which is when we have to cut that piece out of the system in order to study it, in order to map it. You know, we're also, we could say we're terminating it, we're killing it at that one moment, because we make it a cultural object. And as soon as we make it a cultural object, we're also removing it from all of the things that it's connected to. That's a necessary piece in some way for culture. It's part of what we do. But the key is also then how we plug that back in, once we've taken it out, studied it, how we plug that back into a system in order to breathe another kind of life into it. And I think that the same energy that we put into designing larger systems, we should actually be thinking about how we're seeing ourselves operating, and maybe designing those moments, because from the perspective, and this is a very different condition of agency, but from the perspective of the idea of the architect, I've never seen design used in so many other fields outside of design. You know, we had a program, I just moved from San Francisco, but at CCA, that was all about, you know, design thinking, where the studio became the new model for business, you know, and they had the venture lab, you know, studio where they had to design a company, and, you know, architecture was being used as sort of the model for that.
It's happening here
Yeah,
at the business school.
so I think, you know, I think there's lots of other ways we can think about metabolism in relation to our practice from a larger perspective.
Just quickly, I think you hit on something quite important, and something that underlies some of my own thinking recently, is that as we've dealt with ecology, as we've dealt with bigger sets of systems and the coordination of those systems, it's gotten more interesting, more complex. There's some cool stuff going on. You've got bugs and fish and petri dishes and all sorts of shit going on, right? But in some ways, it's a kind of new functionalism. And somehow, if you can justify the way all that stuff works, then you've done a good job. And I think that's part of the frustration that I found most recently through some of the work that we've been doing, research studio and otherwise, that in fact, you know, we have been missing what you talked about as a sort of aesthetic agenda or design or cultural agenda. And I think it's important just to, in some ways, reiterate in a more simplistic way what you were saying, you know, to take on this cultural agenda, to take on an aesthetic agenda, and to kind of reintegrate that, so that the projects aren't about making something work better, but in a sense, the projects are about a whole new set of aesthetic, cultural experiences.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I thought they were great presentations from both you guys, and I really appreciated them in this kind of context and how they've been curated. I think that to answer your question, Hashem, first of all, you've probably been here for so long because it took you 10 minutes to ask the question. And I thought we were going to get a softball kind of thing first. But no, we've got the full-on dissertation. So, you know, and I publicly defended.
He hasn't changed much.
So I'm going to try and answer. You know, I guess a lot of things that you've said. First of all, you know, there is the problem of context and the mapping of all of context as we know it. And I'm gonna use Borges because I love Borges. He's kind of a poet, but I'm paraphrasing, but he was talking about this map for the emperor.
Finis the Memoris.
Yeah, and exactly map the world. So he wanted this. He asked these cartographers to kind of create a map so realistic, so detailed, at such an incredible scale that it would be useful to him to kind of discover new parts of the kingdom and territories. But as they drew more and more into this map, they essentially were drawing, where they created a map the exact same size as the world. And at some point, it shifted between the overlay of what is reality and what is map. So if we can ever achieve the Borgesian map to get this full, actual, comprehensive and visceral, active and performative map, then maybe some of these things that we're doing wouldn't be so speculative, but they would be one-to-one a reality. And I guess when I think of this, I think of all of the, from Frank Lloyd Wright to Bruce Goff, who you've mentioned, to more recently someone like Greg Lynn. I'll send a love beam to Greg Lynn. I think his work is terrific, but he produced something like the embryological house, or Frank Lloyd Wright, doing organic architecture, and they're all essentially acts of simile. It's not an embryo; it's a computer model, and it's maybe been 3D printed, and it's talking about issues in biology. It's talking about issues in genetics. It's using software, and without someone like Greg Lynn standing on the shoulders of Bruce Goff and Frank Lloyd Wright, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I think it's absolutely important, but I recognize it for what it is. It's bioformalism, and it's a mimicking of terms in nature, whether it's third nature or what have you. I think that for me to fully understand it, it's time to work with it within our limited range and capacities, which means probably we need this kind of connection side by side to those who understand it, such as certain scientists, so that we move beyond bioformalism and we can achieve something that is both aesthetic and scientifically relevant.
Can I ask you a question, Mitchell? Because I mean because the question for me is not whether sorry is not whether it's the embryological house is trying to become a new life form. Yeah. It's whether or not the biological paradigm in some way is perhaps generating a new way of thinking about design. And those are two very different things, because for me it depends on what the intention is, and because I'm less interested, when I talk about sort of genetic kind of coding of architecture, it's not what it's trying to simulate as much as other kinds of invention that might happen from borrowing from another discipline in some way.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. It's actually also the filters of reason, and those who are viewing it change their perspectives, etc. There's a little story about this. Mark Forn's, what is he? The Very Many. He's just one guy. Well, there's other guys, but Mark Forns and I were doing some work at Columbia, and we got a phone call from Dr. Ian Cousins, who is an evolutionary biologist at Princeton. He's a great guy. I did a panel talk with him, and he said, we're going to accept a candidate from architecture school to do his doctorates in evolutionary biology. We are so impressed with his computer models that he's produced. And I'm like, really? What's the name of the student? Student wasn't brilliant, wasn't not brilliant, was just good. Was using some scripts you'd find and expressions you'd find in Maya, studying swarm behavior. And it had convinced this group of Princeton evolutionary biologists that it was absolutely accurate. The ironic thing is that it was written, the original code, but those scripts, by Ian Cousin himself in the 80s, and was translated in these softwares to get swarm behaviors done. So when the architects approached, it was a whole new aesthetic kind of region and thought process, to the point where it was not a veil, but something so interesting to them that they needed him a part of their group. So I gave him a great recommendation. I guess he's there now.
I just want to come back to a point that Chris raised, or a term that you used, which is a kind of renewed or new aesthetic experiences that might emerge out of this. And I have to say that as I was watching the presentations and the material, there were moments of brilliance that I just want to highlight a few of them in the work that you were showing. Michu, the Our Tower, which is about Manhattan wanting to see how it's, or making Manhattan see how it's producing trash, also produces a tower, which is the trash that Manhattan has produced and filled the world with. And it's only possible for Manhattan to see this work if, as you did with the sort of tension of putting all the people on the island, it remains isolated as an island, which is this kind of the epitome, the allegory of urbanism everywhere, right? This kind of isolation of the urban again and again. So that in itself, as a kind of experience of understanding the urban as being caught up in itself again and again, is beautiful. And I also thought that the way that we deal with Bucky Fuller's geodesic grid as a form of representation which is produced out of recycled materials, which completely debase its geometric kind of causality is great. And just referring to the projects you were showing, that redistributive creature, can you manufacture them and sell them? I mean, they're amazing because they are. There's something about that form of turning all of the rhetoric of redistribution, which is central to all of the thinking that you're making, into a creature, right? That just spins and produces or reproduces in order to redistribute is very beautiful. And I also feel that some of the projects that you showed were, as you mentioned just right now, that are not bound. And this idea of not bound, but abrupt shifts and breaks, and being able to work through those, inhabit those, experience those, is very important. And this is why I feel that if we are able to elevate those to the aesthetic experience that you were talking about, we would be doing our part. I probably have to open it up to the public. There's a mic here. It's not working.
So I just wanted to raise a couple of questions. I liked Chris Reed's presentation very much. So in fact, I'm not going to ask a question about that one because I'd just like to think about it. But the other two presentations,
Does that mean you didn't like ours?
yeah, yes, I'm afraid. Yes.
I just want to know.
I wanted to pose a question to Mitchell Joachim because he used Thomas Malthus, who is a really kind of reactionary 18th century figure, as a kind of, I couldn't quite work out whether that's an analytical basis for what you're trying to do in relation to 21st century demographic change. And I found that very, very worrying at a political level as well as an analytical level. I was very worried by Isla Berman's set of examples of what it seemed to me a visual assertion that there was some kind of socio-ecological value from all these projects. The High Line, for example, it's really just an adjunct of urban gentrification. And we know from detailed studies by, I won't mention staff by name, but we know studies that, for example, the furniture is certainly non-sustainable in terms of the design. So I don't really see the relationship between a project like that and this wider concern with sort of an ecologically progressive future or socio-ecological advances. I'm speaking as a non-designer, but I don't really see how you can use a series of visual representations to assert fundamental socio-ecological arguments. So I'll leave it there for now.
I'm sorry I offended you with the Malthus thing. To me, it has no, I can't divorce it from any kind of religious or political affectation. My reference was strictly to his understanding and his ability to communicate logarithmic growth of human population, which is seemingly nonstop. And there's no such thing as a system that just grows without penalties. No such thing as a system that just grows and grows and grows and grows with no end. And at some point, if that were true, I guess we can expect us to achieve the same level of the stars. We'd be this endless constellation of people. So it was, if anything, just a very strong and well-rooted footnote into population research. And that's not to skirt the question, but it's the politics for Malthus himself are not necessarily a part of the project. But good you noticed.
Just as a quick response in relation to the High Line, I mean, the example was in relation to, let's say, the range of scales at which we understand trash or waste, or what constitutes waste. And in that case, you know, it's about recycling infrastructure, even though we could do an analysis where you have to start looking, let's say, at the multiple layers with which, you know, the project is operating. So it's not just about sort of recycling large pieces of infrastructure in the city, but what happens when you sort of scale down and look at every single material that's being used in a kind of larger, comprehensive way. But then I think this comes back to the issue about how we understand what constitutes a kind of sustainable system, because at some point we're always constructing a kind of boundary around this system. It's meaning that as much as we saw in sort of the second panel today, the kind of tracking of elements or materials within histories, there's a moment at which we still determine what become both the values that we're ascribing to each of those things, the quantifiable measurements, the scales of operation, and we get to a point where we're still defining the system based on a kind of framework. And I think that it's not exhaustive, but I think it starts to reveal the kind of complexities of some of the things that we're taking on, because we're still limiting them. We're limiting them based on the territory, the time, the population that's using them, et cetera. Every kind of gentrification is a form of recycling, for example, in relation to the core of the city. You know, even if we might think that that's not a sustainable model.
Just actually maybe picking up on Hashim's question and tying back to the first panel. I mean, it's interesting, I think, pervading all three presentations in this panel, and to some degree even in the panel I was in, there's a kind of faith in technology as a kind of key instrument of responding to the kind of, the new challenges of a metabolic urbanism and metabolic processes. And I'm curious, maybe from all of you, is that a kind of unqualified faith in technology? And to what degree does the political kind of re-enter? And I'll maybe ask it specifically, I mean, it's to all of you, but Isla, because you showed so many projects, the question of who the stakeholders or who the projects advocate for is often ambiguous. And so I'm curious, to what degree can technology be a kind of tool of empowerment for various agents, stakeholders, and subjects?
Well, that's a difficult one. Even though it's difficult because I think that technological innovation is important. At the same time, don't have any kind of blind faith in it. I mean, and this might go back to the very beginning in talking about sort of the production of waste, in that design, in some ways, and technological advancement is one of the greatest producers of waste. Even when we talk about, something like design fashion as a great producer of waste within a system. And it's the waste that's produced by a kind of advancement, everything replacing the things that came before it. In a really literal way, it's like the kind of obsolescence of computing. Being out on the West Coast for a number of years, 2005 was like prehistory, in relation to almost anything. But I'm more interested in the way in which technological thinking is linked up with other potentials, not a kind of blind faith in it in and of itself, but seeing it as a supportive innovation and thought, and understanding the realms that it's operating in and what it can produce or what it might produce for us. I think most often, it's a difficult one because, we've gone through a period where just the fascination with the new technology or the new innovation was enough to justify, a particular project. And we didn't have to, and there's a kind of suspending of judgment in relation to those projects to enable them to actually get feet and to grow. And I think that's important. And then there's a moment where we become far more critical around what they're able to produce. I mean, we've seen this through, let's say, the digital revolution. I think we're in like the classical phase of the digital, where it's about somehow justifying what's actually being produced, and it's not just, oh, that's cool, because it's something interesting or new or unique. I think we're actually sorry, Mitchell, but I think we're actually going through that now in relation to the biological, like that we're not going to, necessarily, or the biotechnological, we're not going to necessarily judge what it is that's produced as much as we're fascinated by the actual process of developing it. But I think it's necessary to enable that for certain things to be able to grow and actually develop.
Yeah, I think that's right in a lot of ways. In some ways, the technology becomes a great new tool, a prompt, a way to kind of launch into something in a lot of ways. But I'm as interested in the moments where you step back and allow something else to mess up that system. It's why, too, I'm interested in Alice's redistribution creature, because it's put out there to do something, and yet it messes up the system, constructively messes up the system that it's put out there to interact with.
Is Mitch off the hook? No, you're going to.
No, I'll do. It's a great question. There's the technotopic versus the ecotopic narrative, and there's this promise of faith and abundance in technology, millions of more minds coming online in this great, grand network every day, and that through this we will seek out answers to some of the grand challenges that are there. I mean, Peter Diamandis, these guys in the Singularity Institute, what's his name, Ray Kurzweil, they kind of breed this thinking that technology will and innovation, which is a useless word at this time, but will kind of save us from some of these problems. And it is a bit of a litany. It's almost a religious, quasi-religious like litany that we can have this faith. I am highly skeptical of any kind of technology. My approach has always been skeptical. It's not that I want to take the T out of MIT, but I still think that we have to fully understand it and figure out how it works. There is a seduction that I admit, or some kind of an allure that gets me into it. But it's always checking what's underneath the hood and seeing where something can work better. The ecotopic, the kind of almost the antithetical other, I found to be really I found to be exceptional. We did these projects about homes made out of living trees. Done. Nature works. We don't have to reinvent it or devise it to some level of Newtonium or atomize it into a single particle that we can completely control. It's about observing and seeing how things can maybe be nudged rather than fully controlled. So for us, there is a skepticism in technology and a consistent tension between the ecotopic and the technotopic worlds.
Hi, quick question. Thank you for the presentations. Hashim, I think it's a really interesting point to pose aesthetics against biology, and I want to propose a sort of third point, which seems inherent in the question of metabolism and the practice of architecture and hasn't really been talked about very much, which is labor and regulation and the making of architecture in practice. And I think, in as much as we do get fascinated by issues of technology, biology, and some of these more interesting notions of self-organization, at the moment, cities are being built by people in awkward labor conditions, and I wonder how we can retune maybe some of these large-scale issues about ecology and metabolism into some of these issues.
I'm only the moderator, so I can avoid tough questions.
I'm going to take labor back, or maybe draw an analogy between labor and nature, in the sense that we think about labor as a resource. When we think about labor as a resource, like when we think about nature only as a resource, we don't give it any kind of agency, within sort of a larger system. And at the end of the first panel, the thing I kept thinking, and this was in response to your question sort of earlier today, how do we give nature a voice within sort of a larger metabolic system? And if you use sort of let's say the history of politics in relation to feminism or labor politics, et cetera, it wasn't about absorbing the feminine into a kind of patriarchy and then describing what it would be, but it was saying that a woman has to have her own voice. So what is nature's voice within this system? Because we're still managing it. We're still acculturating it. And we're doing the same thing. We're treating labor in exactly that same way, as a kind of imminent matter that we don't imagine actually has any kind of agency or has any kind of voice within this system. As soon as it does, it actually changes all of the relations of power around the systems that we're operating within. And I think, I kept thinking to myself that climate change was nature's voice at some point, and it's only that moment that it pushes us towards crisis. And maybe the condition of labor is the same one, is that at the moment when there become resistances, when the dynamics of labor absolutely transform, that it will change the kind of structures that are capitalizing on it currently.
First, I didn't know how to answer that, but I can think about colony collapse disorder. Very recent documentary that came out where it didn't even bother to translate the different languages of beekeepers involved with trying to understand what happened to all of their bees. There was an American beekeeper that was responsible for the lives of probably billions of bees a season that grows our entire almond industry. And they're bred to fertilize the trees, and then they're killed off with a fungicide, and then the next year they're put back in place, and they do a lot of labor for us. There was a Swiss beekeeper who, very different working conditions for his bees. They were in this little valley in Switzerland. It was the same genetic kind of historical genetic group of bees and colonies that have been around for probably centuries. His father was a beekeeper. Everyone in his family, he was the greatest, nicest beekeeper on earth. He didn't wear any protection. He just, had a little pipe and a little smoke, and the bees loved him. And they were the same flowers and the same genetic condition had been encapsulated in this valley for some time, but they were dying off as well. Apparently something was wrong. And then went to China, and this is where the labor position and the use of maybe bees as a kind of a force of nature in the service of man became really problematic. In areas of China, they simply just died off. There were no breeders left, and they couldn't keep bees. So they simply gave the job of bees and flowering plants and pollinating them to Chinese laborers who had little Q-tips and would pollinate the plants on ladders. And there were thousands of these people. That's my answer.
Just as a reference, one of the key philosophers who've been working on questions of labor has also been working on questions of aesthetics, and that's Jacques Rancière. And he creates a very interesting connection between the two by arguing that it is precisely at the moment when the craftsman, the architect, the artist, breaks free from the structures of patronage in their labor, that they are able to effect change against the forms of life that society imposes on art. Whereas before the 19th century, he argues, and because they were bound by structures of patronage, artists were only allowed to reflect on and to represent and confirm, ratify existing structures of society. Afterwards, once they broke off that structure of patronage and created more autonomous labor forces, they were able to also produce artistic forms that were resistant to the imposed forms of life. And I'm yearning also for architects to break free from the patronage of science and technology. The next questions were up here, the last two. Are there more than two? Ah, yes, okay, then we collect. Oh, sorry, I skipped coming back to you. He was first. Okay. Do you need a mic? There's one here. So we're collecting questions now? Okay.
So Ilya mentioned how design's becoming, remarkably expansive in all domains now. And I just wonder whether this expansiveness of design and the rise of design science and the draw of biotech, etc., is in some respects related to a kind of a contemporary disappointment with politics. And that, politics has become the big domain of stasis and in effect, and design seems to be creeping through now with this notion that it can do what politics has failed at. So kind of implicit in a lot of the presentations is, you know, this idea that design can somehow circumvent politics in all modes of ways. Design thinking can do that. And I'm just wondering whether, you know, part of the misconnection here is that we don't need design, just design, we need design politics. And there's this discomfort with the idea of design politics, because if you were all, I mean, you're actually quite design political, but if all of you were to say, actually, our visions that we are presenting are choices, they are political choices, they are a gathering together of many possible routes, and here are our values underpinning them, and here are our political choices, that could be an interesting material political moment.
This is actually pretty related. I wonder, what are the processes by which your data becomes elected in order to be shown perhaps aesthetically? And I'm thinking about if you're designing some kind of channelization of a real-time feedback system, then the consumer is also in some sense producing the feedback, which is animating the system. But I wonder, how do we elect then where those consumers get their data, or which data do they get in the process? And I wonder if it can be related in analogy to corporate spending in a democratic country like the United States. So what is the role of kind of the elect of the data that goes into the creation of or maintenance of a real-time feedback system?
Next question. Sorry, can I see a show of hands of the remaining questions? One, that's it. Okay, so we'll take this and that.
Yeah, I was intrigued by some of the language that was used, particularly in the final presentation, this idea of optimizing and the constraints of the system. And I wondered about how that obscured kind of issues around how urban planning and architecture have had roles in creating cities historically, which are sites of domination and injustice and racialization. And in the language of planning in the 19th century, which was also talking about sort of things like statistics for kind of benevolent paternalism, but which, you know, created some of these many injustices. And I just didn't see much evidence in this new approach, which took into account this really problematic history within planning. And I guess my question really was about, in response to the very interesting question about labour and the labour within cities, my understanding of the answer was that it was about the voice that could be given, but I wanted to know whether voice necessarily equates to power.
You have the last question and the last word.
So I guess I'm quite fascinated with ecology in the same way that pretty much everyone in the symposium has been. But this term, so speaking of language, I'm concerned, and I guess I should say, do you share this concern, that by adding the qualifier either artificial or synthetic to ecology, or even the pluralization of that, ecologies, doesn't put us back in this place where I think one of the big themes is that we are not separate from nature or ecology, because if it's an artificial ecology, then I want to, or a synthetic, what is the not artificial or not synthetic, and doesn't it just continue to split that society nature, and that's really the question.
Can I group them as 3 in 1? Just a quick one. That one's a bigger one. So a quick one in relation to the hybrid. I think the hybrid term is still important for me. It's important because in opposition to Jason in the first panel this morning, I think it's important for us still to retain this notion of otherness in relation to nature, a kind of external condition. The hybrid becomes something that places the two together and yet pulls them apart simultaneously, but there's always a reminder that there is this this otherness that is outside, that is not anthropocentric, because I fear the kind of anthropocentric absorption of nature just into our systems, where we say, well, we're all nature, and when we diminish the kind of nature cultural opposition, it has the effect of suppressing our memory, or suppressing everything that is outside of the human realm, to the point that we can then entirely colonize it far more easily. You know, I sit there and I'm always sort of asking about where the animals are, in this kind of funny way that, you know, it's always on another continent, in another place. No, but this is the typical sort of anthropocentric behavior, is to think that we are all it is, but not imagining that there is other voices that are not in the room, or not even part of the discussion. So I think it's still critical, you know, as an idea, to keep nature at bay, and to keep the sort of hybrids there, so that we don't entirely absorb it. On the side of the kind of political discussion, I think that in relation to something like crowdsourcing, for example, because this has been something I've been thinking about a lot lately, in terms of how information is getting pulled now into the system, and crowdsourcing has become this idea that, well, if it's crowdsourced, you know, then it's great data. But the problem is that we're also producing a kind of mud. You know, I mean, I was trying to position sort of the hyper-individualized information on the one side against what has now become a kind of massive information that we're not necessarily filtering in some way. And we're at the point where the way in which we're filtering that information, I think, becomes incredibly critical. You know, that it's not just about assuming that the technology that is somehow linked up with a larger network is going to give us the data that we need, but it's the way in which we're selecting what data, and understanding how that's operating, that I think is one of the most critical things that we're facing now, especially in a world of sort of data overload in relation to this. You know, because the question of optimization is always optimization in relation to what, you know? So in some of the systems, or some of the things that I was showing, you know, optimization was in reference to thinking about technologies that once operated in space, and now understanding them as also operating within time. So a simple example is the difference between having lights on all the time versus lights that go on only when the room is occupied. When you walk in the room, the lights go on, and when you leave, the lights go off. And it's an idea about an optimized system in relation to activity within time. And a lot of some of the sensing that's happening in the city is in relation to that. Or, you know, things being embedded in the road, or in lights that actually sense when there is a parking spot available, you know. So it's optimizing certain conditions about time, because we can all, you know, check in and find out where something is, as opposed to driving around the block 30 times. But I think there's a kind of complexity now that has to do with how we understand the information that we're getting. How we map it, I think, is really critical, and this is an area that was shown a lot today, which is where I think architecture has an incredible amount of expertise in terms of being able to think and spatialize it, and that becomes part of its politics. But starting to be able to filter it, I think, is one of the sort of critical acts and it's a kind of emerging discipline in some way to understand how we're operating within the system.
Relative to the question of ecology and the hybrid, you know, Daniel Botkin wrote almost, I think, 30 years ago in his book Discordant Harmonies. He really traced a kind of history of humans thinking relative to nature, and went through different eras where he described our worldview of nature as being a kind of wild beast, at one point nature as being a kind of loving mother. And he got to the point, I think in 1985 or so, where he was starting to describe nature as the biosphere, the thing that we're all part of, right? And I think in some ways that took what had been a scientific discussion out into the popular realm. But when you listen to the news media and other discussions, contemporary discussions, there still is this positioning vis-a-vis what is human and what is nature. And so in that sense, I think the terminology, as I was saying, is simply helpful in just distinguishing what you mean, right? I don't think, for me, to call something a hybrid ecology or an artificial ecology is recognizing this kind of both and situation, right? But I think it does that to help clarify within a bigger set of discussions what we're talking about. The other piece of it I think you hit on quite rightly is that there are forces that simply are beyond us, right? And I think authors have referred to this as wildness, the other, that sort of thing, things we don't directly control. And for me, that's sort of energizing and a good source of energy. You know, Alan, to your question of data, you know, we're at a moment where I think we have access to more diverse data, more types of data from different sources, and I think all that's good. But on the other hand, you know, anybody doing these models will say that the data is always incomplete, right? No matter how detailed you get, no matter how from how many different sources, you're never going to have a complete picture. So we're always constructing models, and I think for me, again, that's energizing. That's why I come in. I'm not here to get it more and more precise and more right. I'm here to use that data in ways that kind of open up discourse rather than draw conclusions.
I think that design as a politic, I mean, it's absolutely right. Certainly, it's our work. Design is power. A lot of designers don't feel that, or there's some sense of diminished understanding of the value of design, or some neuroses associated with it, and you don't think it has a kind of a signal, and a very strong one. It does. I think it is a part of activism. Adbusters started the Occupy movement, and that came from design and creativity. I think that designers are amazing at taking the general physics of anything, collapsing it into something that can be communicated to others. So it doesn't matter what the story is. I think design can really capture grand themes and hopefully explain that to others, whether it's politics or you name it. And so those who are interested in doing it, using it as a tool, maybe as a weapon, you're certainly capable of doing it. I mean, that's embedded in our work. When we talk about the consumer, or who's this data belong to, for us, you know, we have 40 people sometimes work on a project. They're also the consumers. I mean, we work in a group of researchers. It's very interdisc. It's this heterodox of all different folks. So, and they ask some really naive questions. And I'm sometimes one of those people. I have no clue what someone might be doing. And we learn from one another, and together we become a kind of an interested party that produces a byproduct that happens to be something visual that you can see. There is some top-level control. The partners decide in the hierarchy what should be shown to the public and what's just discard or footnote material. But it's certainly a part of what we do. And then this question about synthetic nature and ecology. I mean, I'm still in discussion with a colleague of mine, Alex Felsen at Yale. We're writing a paper on defining. Well, we didn't want to do this at first, but defining nature. Very bad idea, because we got up to 8 or 9 orders referencing everyone from Leo Marx to who you mentioned and onwards, and I think that we started getting stuck when we were confronted with what does synthetic mean, Well, what is extraterritoriality? What is an asteroid? So an asteroid lands on the Earth. Is that part of our nature? Of course it is. What number is it? I think it's, number 7 or 8. But synthetic biology is just a relationship between humans and nature. It's actually Tim Morton did a good kind of book on this. He said it used the term ecology, not nature. It's the title of the book, because no one knows what nature means. Ecology is definable science. It has its limits. It's knowable. You can quantify it. When we talk about nature all the time, we just set up man's or people's relationship to this thing known as nature, which of course in many cases we are absolutely included inside it, subsumed, or some level of recursion. There is probably no more pure nature if we think about Bill McKibben and the end of nature, where not a single facet of the planet Earth hasn't been influenced by some chemical in the atmosphere or some changing relationship to the climate. So one could say that the first orders of nature, the thoughts of the Garden of Eden and these things are gone, but we can still think about them on a level of phenomenology. It's always a case where unless I can talk to a dolphin or communicate with plants, the sentience of humans will always have some impact on how we relate to nature. So I can't get out of that system. So that we've been defining it as our roles in where nature and people kind of create levels of intersection. So it doesn't mean that we haven't reinvented it a number of times, but it's impossible to remove myself out of the equation when I think about it.
Okay, so thank you so much for being all here. I just want to make 2 final comments. The first one is that Harvard has some amazing things, but one of the ones I'm enjoying very much today is being able to bring half of your literature review for your thesis right here to talk to us directly. So this is one of the amazing things sometimes happens around. The other thing is that for those of you that are also interested in, let's say, this topic, just to reiterate that we are editing, like Nikos Katsikis and myself with an extended editorial board, the next issue of New Geographies that is entitled Grounding Metabolism, where many of these issues and topics are going to be covered in a different manner. So just as a kind of note that this is coming also soon. Again, thanks so much for the speakers in the first place. Thanks to Hashim and the other moderators to be here, and thanks all of you. This has been a great event, and I personally have enjoyed a lot. So thank you again. Thanks.